Everyone laughed when he walked into the luxury auction wearing muddy boots and a wrinkled flannel shirt. By the end of the night, he owned everything in the room, including their silence. They noticed him the second he stepped into the room. He didn't belong, at least not in their world, not in a room filled with silk gowns, polished cufflinks, and auction paddles raised by manicured hands trained to sign checks with too many zeros. The Langford Estate auction wasn't just an event, it was an institution, an annual show of wealth disguised as charity, where egos danced with champagne and everything was for sale, from rare artwork to ancient jewelry with questionable provenance. It was a theater of opulence, and he had walked right onto the stage in dusty boots. He wore a worn flannel shirt, the kind you'd find folded on the clearance table at a ranch supply store. His jeans were clean but faded, and his hands were calloused, not sculpted by gym sessions or golf clubs, but by work, real work. The kind of work most in that room had only ever seen in documentaries or while passing by the help. The eyes found him fast. Some rolled, others narrowed in amusement or disbelief. Conversations paused, then resumed with subtle chuckles and barely hidden sneers. His presence was unexpected, jarring even, like a misplaced brushstroke on a fine painting. They called him many things in their minds: a stray, a wanderer, a fluke. No one considered for a second that he might be there to bid, let alone compete. His name was Colt Henderson, though no one bothered to learn it. Not yet. The auction hall itself was a temple of legacy and excess. Marble floors gleamed under towering chandeliers. A string quartet played softly from the corner. Waiters glided between tables, offering crystal glasses of champagne and appetizers with names longer than the ingredients list. The room pulsed with whispered deals, performed generosity, and careful performance. Everything was curated. Everything was deliberate. And then there was him. He sat in the front row, not nervously, not boldly either, just quietly, like he belonged, and he didn't need to prove it. His posture lacked arrogance but carried something heavier than confidence: indifference, the kind that comes from someone who has nothing to prove to anyone in the room. As the auction began, paddle numbers rose high with choreographed grace. The first few items sold quickly, pieces that screamed prestige more than art. A vintage European sculpture, a limited edition watch, a diamond brooch once owned by royalty. Bids flew across the room like arrows, sharp and fast. The crowd was alive with competition and self-satisfaction. Colt didn't move. Not for the first item. Not for the second. Not even for the rare Chinese vase that sparked a small war between two tech investors near the back of the room. But while his body stayed still, his eyes didn't. They moved slowly across the room, cataloging everything and everyone. The dismissive glances, the whispered mockery. The phones tilted just enough to snap pictures of the stranger in flannel. The way servers were told to skip over him. The way the host scanned past his seat, as if he were invisible. He noticed it all. He always did. The assumptions in that room weren't unusual. In Colt's experience, wealth had a rhythm. Real wealth moved quiet, sat still, and didn't need applause. But performative wealth, that was noisy, hungry, and always looking for something to devour. Tonight he'd walked into a lion's den of performance. What they didn't know, what none of them could guess, was that Colt Henderson had once owned more land than anyone else in the state. Thousands of acres passed down through generations, nurtured, developed, and eventually sold, but not to investors. He sold it piece by piece to fund educational programs, build community centers, and support veterans returning to towns that had long forgotten them. The money? He kept enough, just enough. The rest was planted into others, quietly, without press, without recognition. He didn't crave applause. He craved impact. And yet, tonight, he had a purpose. This wasn't just about the auction items, though he had his eye on a few. Tonight was about something else, a message. Not out of pride, but out of principle. Because Colt had been invited, personally, and not just by anyone, but by the woman who ran the children's charity behind the auction. She'd grown up in the very town where Colt's first scholarship program had taken root. She'd never forgotten him. And when this night rolled around, she made sure his name was at the top of the guest list. She just hadn't warned the others. As the evening wore on, the mockery intensified. It became an undercurrent in the room. Polished shoes shifted when he walked by. Whispered laughter followed his every step. Even staff began to look past him. Still, Colt remained unmoved. The items kept coming. Bids rose. Fortunes danced on price tags. The room drank deeper. The egos swelled higher. Then the auctioneer introduced something that made Colt sit forward in his chair, a small, framed painting by a child who had benefited from the charity's art program. It wasn't worth much to anyone there, but it was priceless to someone who understood where it came from. The crowd didn't see it that way. The opening bid was low, insultingly low. A few laughs broke out. A man near the back scoffed and pretended to raise his paddle as a joke. A woman nearby asked the waiter if children's drawings came with tax write-offs. But to Colt, that painting was the moment the room stopped being a distraction and became a mirror. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out an envelope. And with that quiet motion, everything began to change. The envelope was plain. No gold seal, no custom monogram. Just an off-white fold, slightly creased from sitting close to Colt's chest. But in a room like this, where status was announced in sequins and whispered net worths, the simplicity of that envelope drew a strange kind of silence. At first, no one noticed it, but when Colt stood and handed it to the auctioneer's assistant, without a word, without ceremony, it caught attention. She hesitated. Confusion flickered in her expression. Then curiosity. Then something else. Stillness. The assistant carried it up to the auctioneer mid-sentence, interrupting his usual flourish. He opened it reluctantly, annoyed by the break in rhythm. But the moment his eyes hit the contents, something shifted in his posture. His shoulders straightened. His voice caught. For the first time that evening, he seemed unsure. The auctioneer looked toward Colt with new eyes. He handed the paper to a nearby event official who scanned it, eyes wide, then gave a tight nod. Within moments, a quiet message spread among the organizers behind the scenes. Colt Henderson wasn't just some stranger who wandered in from the cold. He was verified, not just as a donor, not just as a guest, but as someone who had the means to buy the entire catalog. Twice over, the paper held more than a signature. It contained a certified statement from an international financial institution, verifying Colt's liquid assets. A figure most in that room wouldn't believe if they hadn't seen it themselves. But the most shocking part? He hadn't come with an intention to flex his wealth. He'd come with something deeper in mind. The room didn't know yet, but Colt was about to teach them a lesson no bid paddle could rival. At first, the crowd resisted the truth. They didn't want to believe it. They whispered excuses, claimed it was forged, dismissed him as a fluke billionaire, new money, or maybe inherited dirt wealth, anything to cling to their hierarchy. But reality, like truth, has a habit of seeping into even the most insulated spaces. The atmosphere began to shift. The same people who mocked Colt now began avoiding his eyes. Conversations grew guarded around him. Waiters suddenly rediscovered him. Chairs turned toward him. Smiles, thin and forced, flickered across painted faces. Still, Colt remained unchanged. He didn't gloat. He didn't explain. He simply returned to his seat and waited for the next item. It was a leather-bound book of Civil War letters, rare and historical. The auctioneer, still recovering, announced the starting bid, $10,000. Before any paddles lifted, Colt made a subtle gesture toward the stage. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a slight raise of his hand, an indication. The auctioneer paused, then cleared his throat. The bid was now $50,000. There were gasps, scattered and sharp. Some hands went up out of habit, only to fall again once they realized who they were bidding against. No one dared challenge him. He won the item, not with bravado, with silence. The next piece, an Italian sculpture, was met with the same. The moment Colt showed interest, the room backed down. Not from respect, but from fear, from embarrassment, because they had already spent the earlier part of the evening using him as a punchline. Now the punchline was writing checks they couldn't afford. Piece by piece, Colt claimed the room. A Victorian diamond necklace, a rare vintage motorcycle, a painting from a forgotten master. With each item, his bids were clean, calm, and unrelenting. He wasn't there to compete. He was there to collect. But not for himself. Every item he purchased was noted under a different recipient name. Charities, museums, and small-town community centers no one in that room had ever heard of. He wasn't stockpiling prestige. He was redistributing it. By the halfway mark, the night had transformed. No more laughter, no more whispers, only stunned silence and stares. Colt, the man in flannel, had become the gravitational center of the evening, and yet he remained as steady as when he arrived. He drank water. He spoke to no one unless necessary. He didn't pose for pictures. He didn't flinch at attention. And as the orchestra played its intermission medley, the auction hall sat in the shadow of its own humiliation. The socialites who had giggled behind their champagne glasses avoided his gaze now. The executives who had joked about his boots suddenly found their voices tangled in their throats. Even the host, the ever-confident auctioneer, seemed smaller, less polished, more aware of every word he spoke. By now, the story had begun leaking beyond the walls. A reporter near the back, who had recognized Colt's name from an obscure nonprofit donor list, was already typing away, her phone quietly sending messages to editors. It was becoming legend in real time. And Colt? He was just getting started. What none of them realized was that his presence wasn't spontaneous. He had been watching this event for years, heard the stories, seen the photos, knew exactly the kind of people who filled this ballroom. And he'd decided, this year, it was time to show up, not to fight them, but to expose them, not with anger, but with a mirror. And now, as the second half of the auction loomed, the question wasn't if Colt could outbid them. It was how far he would go, and whether anyone would be brave or foolish enough to challenge him. By the time the auction resumed, the ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. It had become a slow, collective unraveling. Ego was retreating, masks were slipping, and the air, once thick with self-importance, now carried something new: discomfort. Colt Henderson hadn't just interrupted the rhythm of the evening, he had upended its entire ecosystem. People who once strutted across the floor like royalty now moved carefully, deliberately, as if trying to avoid his gaze. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the gnawing realization that they'd misjudged someone, and not just someone, but the person who now held the reins of the entire event. The second half of the auction began with one of its headline pieces, a diamond-studded pocket watch once owned by a 19th-century railroad tycoon. The crowd barely looked at the item. Their eyes were on Colt. He sat calmly in the same chair as before, fingers laced in front of him, shoulders relaxed, the picture of patience. No drama, no posture, just presence. The auctioneer's voice, once booming with forced charm, had softened. Gone was the exaggerated confidence. In its place was a professional trying to keep composure while knowing he was no longer in control. The bid began. A few brave attendees tried to participate. Half-hearted gestures, unsure glances. But the energy was gone. They weren't competing anymore. They were surviving. Colt raised his hand. The number he offered wasn't just higher, it was final. There were no challengers. The item was his. Again. And so it continued. Item after item. Painting after sculpture. Antique after heirloom. Colt bought them all. No hesitation, no second-guessing. Not with arrogance, but with utter clarity. His bids came not as challenges, but as quiet declarations of dominance, a reminder that he had never been beneath them. They had simply never seen him. As his purchases mounted, the room's hierarchy collapsed. People began whispering names they hadn't spoken in years. Banks, investment firms, philanthropic boards, all trying to figure out where Colt fit. But there was no blueprint for him. He didn't dress the part. He didn't talk the talk. And that unsettled them more than anything. Behind the scenes, the auction's organizers scrambled. Phones buzzed, messages were sent, background checks were rerun. Every time, the results came back the same. Colt Henderson was not only legitimate, he was one of the wealthiest men in attendance and possibly the most generous. But he had never advertised it, and that made it worse for those who did. Toward the back of the room, some guests began quietly excusing themselves, pretending to take calls or claiming early flights. Others stayed rooted, unsure if leaving would be more humiliating than staying. The silence in the room now felt like judgment, thick and merciless. And Colt? He remained untouched. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He didn't return the stares. He simply kept buying. Not for display, not for ego, but for impact. For every item won, he scribbled a quiet note to a foundation, a museum, a school. Some items were gifted to small-town historical societies, others to libraries in places most people in the room couldn't pronounce. It wasn't charity for applause, it was justice for a room that had mistaken performance for substance. And then came the final stretch. A series of rare personal letters from American presidents. An 18th-century piano played at Carnegie Hall. A sculpture from an obscure European master. One by one, they passed through the stage and into Colt's possession. With each win, the room seemed to grow smaller, as if the walls were closing in on everyone else. But Colt wasn't done. As the final item approached, a diamond-encrusted medallion from a European royal family, the crowd braced for the ritual they now understood too well. But this time, Colt did something different. He stood, not abruptly, not dramatically. He just rose from his chair, calm and certain, as if finishing a thought he'd been forming all night. There was no speech, no monologue. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a second envelope. This one was thicker. The auctioneer accepted it with trembling hands. He opened it carefully, eyes scanning the paper within. It was a written instruction, a final bid, and with it a simple clause. This bid covers every remaining item in the auction hall. Not just the current item, all of them. Whatever hadn't been sold, Colt would purchase outright, at triple the estimated value. The room broke. For a full 10 seconds no one moved. No one breathed. It was over. He hadn't just participated. He hadn't just won. He had bought the entire event, every remaining item, every display, every symbol of wealth and power in that glittering room. It now belonged to the man they had dismissed with a smirk the moment he stepped inside. But Colt wasn't finished. After handing off the envelope, he walked to the center of the room, not toward the stage, not toward the cameras, but to a small display that had been largely ignored, a table showcasing letters and drawings from the children the charity supported. There he stood quietly, hands in his pockets, eyes focused not on his audience, but on the crayon-colored dreams of kids he would never meet. He stayed there for a moment, long enough for the silence to become sacred. Then, just as calmly, he turned and walked out. No announcement, no photos, no interviews, only stunned faces in his wake and a room filled with things they could no longer buy back. The room didn't return to normal after Colt Henderson left. It couldn't. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed louder than the applause had earlier in the night. In its wake there was no laughter, no whispered bragging, no champagne clinks. Just a stunned collective stillness, as if the very fabric of their world had shifted. No one knew quite what to do. The auctioneer stood motionless, his voice silenced by the enormity of what had just unfolded. Staff buzzed quietly along the edges, unsure whether to continue cleanup or simply wait. Guests lingered in their seats, some staring blankly ahead, others still scrolling through their phones for any explanation, any digital breadcrumb that might help them understand who that man really was and how they'd gotten it so wrong. Within 24 hours, they'd all know his name, not just the ones in that ballroom, but the world. Billionaire rancher silences Manhattan's elite in unforgettable auction standoff. The humble titan, who is Colt Henderson? They laughed at his boots. He bought the auction. But to those who had been there, the headlines barely scratched the surface, because what Colt exposed wasn't just financial arrogance, it was social blindness. He had arrived without pretense, without spectacle, and they'd treated him as disposable, a footnote, an anomaly, and in doing so, they had broadcast the smallness of their own values to anyone who was paying attention. In the following days, the ripple effect became tidal. The charity at the center of the auction, previously known more for its high society galas than its field work, suddenly found itself the recipient of millions in unsolicited donations, not from corporations trying to impress, but from everyday people moved by the story of a man who valued crayon drawings more than diamond medallions. Colt's contribution alone would fund 5 years of full programming across dozens of schools and shelters. And still, he stayed silent. He refused interviews, declined press. When journalists found their way to his ranch, they were met with polite refusals. No grand statements, no memoirs, just one written line through a spokesperson. "I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to make sure someone else was." Back in Manhattan, the social fallout deepened. Several of the evening's most outspoken guests, those who had made jokes at Colt's expense, found themselves the subject of viral montages and public backlash, screenshots of their sneers, captions quoting their earlier mockery, memes that framed their arrogance with brutal clarity. Sponsors pulled endorsements. Boards distanced themselves. A few locked their social media accounts and issued vague apologies about misunderstandings. But the real damage wasn't to their reputation. It was to their illusion of control. They had built entire lives atop curated images of influence and status, only to be unmasked in a single evening by a man who never once raised his voice. The Langford Foundation, embarrassed but wise enough to recognize a turning tide, pivoted immediately. They publicly acknowledged Colt's contributions, not just his financial ones, but his moral presence. They released a statement about revisiting their values, opening more space for unsung donors, and holding future events with transparency and inclusiveness. It was all necessary, but none of it erased what had happened. And in some corners, that was the point. In the months that followed, people spoke of Colt like a legend. They referenced the night as a story to share, not just as gossip, but as a parable, about assumptions, about ego, about humility wrapped in denim and silence. His image, head down, shoulders steady, walking past marble floors and chandeliers, became a quiet icon. But Colt never reappeared. He didn't capitalize on the moment. No foundation was named after him. No podcast interviews, no motivational speeches. He simply returned to his land, to the hills and horses, to work. For him, the auction had never been a battlefield. It had been a lesson, one taught without words. Yet his impact lingered. Some of the art pieces he purchased now hung in small-town galleries, their plaques reading, "Donated anonymously." A restored Civil War letter collection became the centerpiece of a public library in a low-income district. The child's painting he had bid on first was now framed behind bulletproof glass in a youth center named after the artist herself. Those who had laughed no longer laughed. Those who had watched and said nothing remembered the silence. And those who had listened, they changed, slowly, quietly, because that's what real power does. It doesn't demand attention, it commands it. simply by being undeniably real.